It's my pleasure to introduce Paul Christopher Johnson from the University of Michigan. And Professor Johnson's talk is the second talk in this year's Hemisphere of America speaker series that I coordinate with Krista Bruni and Judy Sierra Rivera and through the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. Can't forget the Italians. This year's iteration is on Brazil and the Americas, and we'll have two more speakers, Jens Anderman and Seth Garfield, coming later this semester, so we hope you'll join us for those as well. So today, Paul Christopher Johnson is Professor of History and Afro-American and African Studies, and he also teaches as part of the doctoral program in Anthropology and History at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He is the author of Secrets, Gossip, and Gods, the transliteration of Brazilian Candomblé, winner of the American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence. He's also the author of Diaspora Conversions, Black Carib Religion, and the Recovery of Africa, which was awarded the American Historical Association's Leslie Logan Prize for Best Book on the African Diaspora. And most recently, he's the co-author of Ecclesia, Church and State in the Americas, with Winifred Fowler-Sullivan and Pamela E. Glassett. He is the editor of the volume Spirited Things, the work of possession in Afro-Atlantic religions, and is now finishing a book entitled Automaton, Mechanics of Religion in Brazil and France, which explores the tension between automatism and agency in ritual. Professor Johnson has been a Guggenheim Fellow and twice an NEH Fellow, among other awards, and since 2016 he is the co-editor of the interdisciplinary journal Comparative Studies in Society and History. And I'll just add that I've taught Professor Johnson's work as part of my grad seminar on race, performance, and possession, and something really remarkable about it, and I thought he would be a good speaker for the Complet Luncheon, is that it really brings together different disciplines, bridging fields such as political philosophy and religion in very innovative ways. So we thank you very much for coming.
Human-like automata perceived as having life and agency are recurring devices of religious worlds. And today I want to offer an account of this notion by considering such figures' material form, calling on a particular character from late 19th century Rio de Janeiro to build my case. But let me begin with a few familiar examples just to tune our ears and set the stage. Aristotle described how Daedalus caused a wooden Venus to move with quicksilver. Hesiod described Pandora, an automaton fabricated by Hephaestus and Athena. South Asian tales of Vishnu statues or Indian kurta dolls that come to life. In the Jewish tradition, that of the golem described by Gershom Scholem as a motor soul with strength greater than humans but without rational soul. Orion al-Jazari's Book of Ingenious Devices in the Islamic world, a hydraulic and musical automata that enlivened the world of kings and patrons. Jessica Riskin explored the impressive divine and diabolical qualities communicated through inspirited statues from the late 15th and early 16th century, the mechanical devils, mobile Jesuses, ascending angels. She wrote, quote, early modern Europe was alive with mechanical beings, and the Catholic Church was their main patron. There were many roles for these mechanical persons in ritual life, as spectacle, oracle, moral instructor. Among the 16th century monk bots, or praying automatons, for example, was this one crafted by Juanello Tuliano, studied by Elizabeth King. This Capuchin saint, San Diego, walked, turned, grasped the rosary, and lifted it to his lips as his eyes rolled in somber trance, and his purpose seems to have been to admonish the emperor's wayward son. These figures could announce the proximity of royal to divine power, the hydraulic automata at the fountains of the kingdoms of Prester John and the Great Khan, as announced in the Travels of Mandeville, that linked sacred kinship and Mongol exceptionality. There were also automata seen as dangerous sorcery, and on this vector falls the story of Descartes' mechanical doll, Francine, who, when discovered aboard the ship carrying Descartes to Queen Christina of Sweden in 1649, was called black magic and the source of a gale the captain ordered the doll thrown into the sea. And there are automata seen as the path to become godlike through the powers of creation. These stories range from Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein, the obligatory Shelley reference in the Bicentennial, and earlier Paracelsus instructions for how to make a homunculus from scratch in 1537. Now, I list such an odd tangle of examples only to attune you to the long history of what we might call religious uses of mechanical near humans. Let me now scale down from that flyover view. There's a particularity to 19th century models. In the wake of the Enlightenment, automata pressed into thoroughly this worldly service, body with defecating ducks and buxom Venuses. In the 19th century, human-like automata bifurcated into two lines. On the one hand, they became banal, everyday mass-produced devices. By the end of the 1800s, automata were less showpieces of elites than a form of amusement available to all. The toy maker Ferdinand Martin sold small automata by the thousands, the bestseller of 1890 being the Diable en boîte, a little devil that sprang up from a box to be smashed on the head by a neighboring figurine, and the precursor of the Jack-in-the-Box. That same year witnessed the debut of Edison's talking doll in New York, which was a commercial failure due to the strange mismatch between the figure's appearance and the voice it produced. On the other hand, there were figurations, including fictional, that advanced a new spiritual project through maple or metal frames. And the most obvious here is Frankenstein, too familiar to warrant long rehearsal, but let me just recall to your attention some of the spiritual themes. Shelley's android thrilled to the sublime beauty of nature and was moved by reading Paradise Lost. He could only arrive near to humanness, a bitter poison, for in some ways he was less than human. A strange rattle betrayed his voice, among other flaws, but in other ways he was more, 8 feet tall, with superhuman strength and endurance, quote, more than mortal speed, unquote, and unusual powers of persuasion, quote, as if possessed of magical powers, unquote. The protagonists, maker and maid, were attracted like magnets. They begin to exchange parts and qualities. The monster thrills to the sun and songbirds, much like the doctor. Meanwhile, the doctor begins to mimic the machine, becoming mechanically driven and filled with the voices of others. The strange resemblance, so-called, between Drosselmeyer and his automaton, Nutcracker, published just 2 years before Shelley's, suggested a similar approximation. In a century after Frankenstein, the Czech author Karel Čapek conjured a new vision with his neologism robot from the Old Slavic rabu, slave. It appeared in the script for his play R.U.R. Rossum's Universal Robots, first performed in Prague in 1921. In this play, the artificial persons, very camp, I would say, were likewise similar to, but subtly distinct from humans. The robots remember better than people, but never laugh or experience happiness. They have a larger intellectual capacity than bio people, but no concept of history. They assemble to form governing institutions, but can't reproduce. They have no fear of God. And of course, the persistent refrain, no soul. Though the play's ingenue Helena persuades one Dr. Gall to open certain robots and alter their correlates to give them personhood. Well, there are lots of themes linking Frankenstein and R.U.R., bookending a century from 1820 to 1920, but I'm interested in the most obvious one, the question of soul, will, or agency, inside of but distinct from an external body. What is inside the machine? The texts are deliberately vague, and what they do is direct attention to the problem of interiority and the disjuncture between the interior and exterior. I'm tempted here to resort to the word uncanny to describe the sensation they produced, had Freud not too famously inhabited that word in 1919. But perhaps if I conjure Ernst Jentsch to speak through Unheimlich rather than Freud, for it was Jentsch in 1906 who first cast uncanny in relation to E.T.A. Hoffman's story of the Automaton. Jentsch read Hoffman in ways more useful to me than Freud. The uncanny Jentsch proposed The uncanny is the disorientation and uncertainty when animate and inanimate become confused. When a man falls in love with a lifelike machine woman and goes mad, or, he extended the argument, when in the presence of a wax museum figure that too closely resembles a natural person, or when one abruptly sees a person previously thought of as organic as now being guided by a mechanism. That is, automata may evoke the sensation of the uncanny because of their too human form, but actual humans can also become uncanny when they suddenly appear to be too mechanical. The uncanny is disorienting and disruptive, and yet, Chinch argued, while such experiences of disturbing disorientation may derive from temporary states like drunkenness, hallucinations, or darkness, they may also be cultivated, as when, quote, one undertakes to reinterpret some kind of lifeless thing as part of an organic creature in anthropomorphic terms, unquote. Now, I find this very useful, the idea that we are drawn toward the disorientation or vertigo caused by proximity to human-like machines, and that groups may even design forms and spaces and ritual procedures to induce such encounters and vertigo. And so with Jench's notes in mind, let's now scale them further to specific automata like the famous chess-playing Turks. Von Kempelen's chess-playing machine man in Europe caused one woman to make the sign of the cross over her heart and utter prayers, calling the figure possessed. Johann Malzel purchased von Kempelen's Automaton and adorned it with new flourishes like the vocal announcement of victory in French, échec. And Malzel's revamped Turk found success in Paris, London, and Amsterdam before arriving in New York in 1886. There, according to one report, quote, the chess automata enchanted the credulous and the skeptical alike. Some spectators fled the room or even fainted when the automaton began to stir. Unquote. But the secret of its soul came to light in 1827 when schoolboys climbed a wall to witness a player exit from its interior and unfold himself. And as copy androids began to be fabricated in the United States, the Turks' fame and market share waned. Malzel resolved then to take the automaton to Havana, and then on to Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. But in Cuba, both Malzel and the player inside, Schlumberger, the soul of the Turk, contracted yellow fever and died off the coast of Charleston as they tried to return north. New machine men took the Turks' place, still bearing names swapped in mystic and orientalistic allure. Mephisto, Ajeeb, Azra, until finally there was Ajeeb, built by the Englishman Charles Alfred Hooper in 1868, and named by the Urdu word for strange or wonderful, taken from 1001 Nights. Ajeeb was set to work at Manhattan's Eden Musée, where he arrived on August 1st, 1885. He consisted of a papier-mâché body set cross-legged, with a head of wax topped by a white turban accented with a red velvet cape. Like Frankenstein's machine, he was larger than life, 7 feet tall and seated on a 3-foot platform. Like Frankenstein, he was orientalized. He held a hookah pipe in his immobile left hand and sometimes wore a stuffed cockatoo on the right shoulder. His trade card did not bother much about chess. Rather, it was about his seances, extraordinary and mysterious, and his strange near-human quality that were announced. Quote, its movements are so lifelike that it is difficult to believe it is now endowed with life, unquote. But he also played. In fact, he played all the time, against opponents from Sarah Bernhardt to O. Henry, and he easily earned his keep for over a decade at the Eden, until by 1895, Ajeeb's slot at the Eden was filled by a new player of the Mystic East named Chang, a Chinese mandarin with a spiky mustache and a blue and green embroidered satin robe. Ajeeb returned sporadically to work and remained in periodic service at the Eden until 1915. And even thereafter, he stayed active and still conferred occasional strange frisson. Frank Frame became co-owner of Ajeeb in 1932 and kept him boxed up in his Cadillac. A staunch Irish Catholic, Frame took Ajeeb to be blessed at the shrine of Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré near Quebec City. And as late as 1943, he kept Ajeeb's head in his Queens apartment, at times massaging his cheeks, combing his beard, and moistening his eyelids with Vaseline. Quote, "When I set him up in the right light with mirrors and drapes, there is a lot of controversy as to whether he's alive." Unquote. That original Ajeeb seems to only have left New York that once for his baptism, but copycat versions were very much in motion. And in 1896, one such Ajeeb was purchased by a Czech-born Jewish immigrant named Fred Figner and shipped to Brazil. Fred Figner emigrated to the United States as a teenager in 1882. He settled in San Antonio, where he worked as a traveling salesman. He purchased an Edison phonograph in 1891 and headed for Belém, Bethlehem, in the Amazon. Figner gained fame as the owner of the talking machine, the Máquina Falante, a strange device able to speak and even outflank time by capturing human voices of the past and projecting them into the sonic present. At least 4,000 residents of the city of Belém paid to see his demonstration, attending 5-hour shows that lasted all afternoon. A smash success, the performances were repeated in town after town as Figner made his way toward Rio de Janeiro. And in fact, the machine became called the Figner machine. On a trip to New York in 1895, Figner added to his attractions by purchasing an edition of the Automaton Ajeeb. And by May 1896, Figner set up Ajeeb in Rio on the rollicking Ouvidor Street, the center of nightlife, and the center of the press as well, and invited reporters from every newspaper. Ajeeb impressed the journalists. One of them wrote, quote, "Yesterday we had the opportunity to witness the ingenious automaton who plays drafts with precise expertise, defeating all adversaries presented to him. His game is perfect, as is the apparatus. What is the secret? What is the soul of the automaton? It resides in an expert homunculus insinuated in the large cavities of the automaton. But this doesn't diminish the machine's curiosity, which definitely merits a visit," unquote. As had occurred with previous versions of the Turk, commentators lingered over the question of Ajeeb's soul. But his superhuman aura dimmed rapidly in Rio, in part because the great Ajeeb lost several times in short order, once to Augusto Guimarães, and again very publicly to a customs agent named Claudino Alves de Castillo. And Figner's brother was forced to take Ajeeb out of town and on the road to save face. But a few months later, the automaton was back in Rio, now as the new Ajeeb. And this time he took his place along two brand new attractions brought by Figner. One was Inanna, named after an ancient Mesopotamian goddess akin to Venus. Inanna was billed as a silpharama, a trick of mirrors that created the illusion of a goddess floating in the air without the benefit of strength. The other was a human volcano who could breathe fire. These three, the indomitable Ajeeb, the celestial Inanna, and the mighty son of Vulcan, were a juggernaut trinity. They were called the three phenoms. No surprise that Ajeeb could so quickly regain face and profit. For after all, even prior to losing a few matches, his capacity had long been exposed. Most of the audience understood that the automaton contained a human operator. This was, after all, a century after the tours of von Keppelen's Turk. And by this time, the only mystery, the game, was how the human hand could be so well concealed. That is, the modern spectator's skill of sustaining disbelief was very much part of the show. In the first week of play, in May 1896, the Commerce Journal, Journal de Comercio, was rapturous over Ajeeb's human likeness, his ability to indicate impatience with a shake of the head, for example, and forthright in revealing that Ajeeb's secret and soul was a homunculus insinuated in the cavities of the automaton. A few days later, the paper doubled down on the debunking. The soul of the automaton was, they wrote, a dwarf in the Turk. And yet the revelations seem to accentuate the figure's strange presence more than unmake it. The soul of a near-human machine is a homunculus insinuated in an automaton's cavity, or a dwarf and a doyen in a giant's Turk. Descriptions that is fascinated as much as disenchant. Like former automata, Ajeeb presented an allure neither human nor non-human. Perhaps Ajeeb gave material form to the uncertain nature of agency, to the gap between external acts and internal actors. Philip Thickness had described von Kempelen's machine a century before, back in 1784, as, quote, a man within a man, who bears a living soul within, unquote. The prospect of fraud did not undermine the force of the hidden agent. To the contrary, it seemed to perform it or render it in an emotionally forceful way. Where and who is the operator working behind or within? But then who controls that operator? That is, the visual effect seems to have overwhelmed any rational explanation. Bruno Latour wrote that the puppeteer is always somehow encompassed by her marionettes, even while she controls them. Latour described their hybrid effect as a prolific confusion of agent and object, fact and fetish, factish. He called such hybrids slight surpassings or events. And this is because the puppeteer is herself transformed by her performance. She is herself inflected by her marionettes. She is never merely herself as a puppeteer, rather always herself and herself through. And just so with the operator in Ajeeb. Latour described his theory of hybrid actants as a blasphemous theology of creation. And I see his point. The gap between visible exterior and a secret interior space, body and soul or agent, is a generative frame for religious thought. And in conforming to that diagram, Ajeeb, in certain respects, recapitulated the form of earlier near-human actors. The golem, whose animation depended on drafting a secret name inserted into the cavity of a clay head. The devil in a box that popped from dark cubicle into light and then retracted. Dr. Gall and the RUR robot that he could open up, change the correlates, and close again. Here I follow Alfred Gell to suggest that this material form and structure is a particularly effective religious trope. Gell proposed that icons across multiple traditions use the structure of external shells with hidden inner compartments. His examples include Catholic saints, Indian gods like Hanuman, the Jewish Ark of the Covenant, even the architecture of a medieval church, which to be consecrated required the insertion of hidden relics in the floor or altar to animate the space. The forms are animated and gain in spiritual force via what Gell called building on Lucretius, the duplication of skins. And I could add more examples from the Atlantic world. The Nkizi sculpture of Central West Africa and Brazil and Cuba, the Haitian Wanga, a Peji on a Candomblé altar. And I won't go into these, but I simply want you to get a sense of their material form. for even more than just having secret containers, these forms announce and advertise that feature. They foreground or feature the external door, the lid, the entrance or passage that might give access to the interior. This is key because our perception of these entrances, Gell proposed, motivates an abduction. It causes us to imagine the agent that occupies the visually suggested secret place. And Gell is building on cognitive theories that suggest that this is inevitable. That is, it's not really a conscious process. That conjured agent is called, in Gell's terms, a homunculus, and usually in human form. Finally, it's not just that religious icons, altars, or buildings often take this form, but that taking this form renders anything spiritual. So, for example, a human body becomes sacred, the living icon, when seen as a container of a special agent. Objects, including human bodies, become religious through the visible announcement of hidden chambers that call interior agents and the disjuncture between interior and exterior to the mind of a perceiver, or what Gell calls a patient. Gell uses the example of painting a third eye on the forehead in Nepal. It's a window to the god housed in a young woman, but it's also a powerful announcement of that window. Similarly, in Brazilian candomblé, a state of holding a god inside, that is, being able to be possessed by a god, is physically communicated by opening and reclosing the head, now publicly marked as a made head, cabeça feito. An Afro-Brazilian candomblé initiate advances into deeper secret knowledge through rituals of making the head that include opening the head, putting herbal insertions into it, and then closing it again, announcing that closure with the adoshu cone covering the wound, which publicizes and announces the new status of an initiate as adoshu. Now, in all these cases, what is shaped is a body within a body, an exterior that may or may not correspond with interior character. An automaton, both the idea and the material of it, calls the notion of unseen interior human-like agency to mind through duplications of skins that publicly announce a secret compartment. From this perspective, what are religious things like? Or if you prefer, what kinds of things lend themselves to religious deployments? Perhaps objects that announce and advertise their doubleness through layers, obvious concealments, compartments, passages. And religious people, from this perspective, could be seen as adept users of such material things. They are attracted and motivated to bring themselves into alignment and alliance with them, even to cast themselves in the mold of such double things. And so to be abducted into what Gell calls religion situations. Now, if this is right, this line of reasoning, then Ajeeb should have inspired some abductions like this. He should have catalyzed or taken part in new religious production, inspiring these kinds of motivations. Ajeeb flourished in Brazil for only a little more than a year, from May 1896 to July 1897, after which Figner kept Celestial Inanna in play, but mostly moved decisively towards sound recording and sales in new technologies. By 1901, his advertisements announced a paradise of phonographs, gramophones, Franklin typewriters, magnetic soles to cure rheumatism, electric alarm clocks, table fans, sewing machines, incandescent lights, and others on a list of American novelties. By 1902, he had secured the rights to thousands of songs, and Figner became the founder of recording music in Brazil. He expanded from the phonograph to making records and film, acquiring enormous wealth and fame, establishing the Casa Edison, the first recording studio, and Odeon, the first record maker, both in Rio de Janeiro. As the 20th century dawned, Figner had little need for Ajeeb. Perhaps Ajeeb was a transition object in relation to which Rio de Janeiro, or at least certain bourgeois sectors of it, moved from a tropical belle epoque of wonders to a 20th century industrial mode of life with mechanized entertainments like film and recorded music. Walter Benjamin registered, for example, Automaton fatigue by 1896. When he cited Paul Lindau in Berlin, you have no idea how repulsive these automatons and dolls can become, and one breathes at last, encountering a full-blooded being in this society. End quote. And maybe this transpired in Rio too, this fatigue, given how Ajeeb disappeared, though he did live on in text. By July 1897, there was a book for sale called Soul of Ajeeb on strategies for checkers. But more to my point, he may have, in a small way, acted as a tributary to the river of spirits. And if so, this would present an uncanny apotheosis and inversion, a mechanical man's occupation of a person or a god. For Ajeeb, the automaton Turk directly accompanied the first wave of actual immigrants to Brazil called Turks. And the timing of it pushes us to plot Ajeeb in a social history register. Between 1879 and 1947, 80,000 Syrian Lebanese immigrants settled in Brazil. And these disparate groups, Lebanese, Syrian, Moroccan, or Turk, were all conjoined under the ethnonym Turco, which roughly denoted anyone carrying an Ottoman passport. If the Moor was part of Portugal's roots and history, as Gilberto Freire argued so strongly, the Turk now was seen as a threat. Though the Ottoman Empire still projected power and wealth, social Darwinist theories of race prevailed. Polemics decried the mongrelization of an emerging nation whose elites already lamented their nation's lack of purity, the new republic just a few years old from 1889. By 1891, Rio's newspapers complained of the swarm, enxame, overrunning the capital in Rio. One editorial went further, quote, "Lock the doors so that they do not infiltrate our organism, bringing the evil virus of an indolent people," unquote. The Turco conveyed Oriental mysticism, decadent sensuality, and a dangerous invasion of the social body all at once. In these kinds of editorials, Brazil itself was imagined as a body or a house with insecure, permeable exteriors vulnerable to invasion and interior occupation. The national body, one might say, mirrored Ajeeb's form, composed as an exterior frame directed by a hidden inner force. The national body was in question. Who is the manager within? An 1899 short story by the United States writer Ambrose Bierce, Moxon's Master, presented an automaton chess player to play on the same fears: red fez on head, dark hair, simian arms. And upon losing to his maker, he erupts in rage, reaches across the board, and locks his master's throat in a fatal grip. Elites in Brazil viewed the arrival of migrants from the Ottoman Empire in roughly these terms. Fear led to an attempt to fashion a closed body against a dangerous homunculus that might be growing inside. But this was not the only course. Another path was to adopt the Turk as a new source of spirit power. In the 1890s, one priestess, Mai Andreza, began to receive the King of Turkey spirit in her body, and she opened a Turkish temple, and others followed suit. They invoked not only the King of Turkey, but another Turkish spirit called Mariana Turca, identified with a species of parrot, with whom she is pictured here. And there's more to this story than I can tell today, but is it possible that the chessman Turk infiltrated the spirit Turks that now routinely inhabit bodies in Brazil? It seems likely. The phenomenon of Ajeeb and the spirits called Turcos derived from common sources during the same period. Together, they form a pool of things and images out of unknown interiors from which religion situations and religious production followed. Many of the qualities set and cast in the character of Ajeeb were reproduced in ritual practices of a religion called Mbanda, born in 1920. And probably they were in play since the first part of the 20th century. In their couture, aesthetics, materials, and props, always turbans, pipes, birds, and amulets. The Turcos take over a human body to present a compelling spectacle, like Ajeeb, of a body acting within a body. Turcos are sometimes depicted on altars in materials and style, much like Ajeeb. And most curious of all, a medium who receives a Turco spirit is often referred to as an apparatus, an aparelho. This was the same term applied to the sound and light machines that Figner was selling and showing. Aparelho fonográfico, aparelho cinematográfico. In fact, the term aparelho, apparatus, came in through Spiritism, Figner's preferred religion. He seems to have taken the word from Allan Kardec's Book of Spirits. My idea here is that through Ajeeb and the Turks' multiple notions of bodies within bodies, homunculi, mechanical, religious, and national, converge to produce a new hybrid of an automaton, checkers playing Turk, actual migrant Turks, Figner's talking machines, and a class of superhuman spirits called Turks. One final word. If Ajeeb disappeared, Fred Figner became a national legend. Figner's close engagement with sound, light, and electric energy guided him towards Spiritism, which saw human bodies as vehicles, apparatuses, or batteries of the sacred. And Spiritism became his religion. He became the close friend, confidant, and major financier of Brazil's most famous spiritist, Chico Xavier, who wrote hundreds of books through a process of automatic writing. After Figner died in 1947, his spirit appeared to Chico Xavier, who gave the spirit voice through his pen and ink. Thus, perhaps we could say Figner, through Chico Xavier, and through Chico's mediation of Figner, the automaton Ajeeb lived on, a body in a body in a body, the duplication of skin. Thank you.
So it's time for discussion. Hi there. I enjoyed that very much. My name is Rose, and I wanted to ask you to make one comment and two questions. First of all, you mentioned St. Anne de Beaupré, and I'm just, there's a huge social context there in terms of the notion of shrines, of St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, and leaving behind the automatons that make the person walk when they're sick. So there's a whole another dimension, I think, to that context that would be really important to maybe, or could be not important, that sounds fatuous, but it could be really interesting to think about in terms of what automatons that you leave behind once you're prayed over and you're cured. There's like 500 crutches, all in various stages of rot in St. Joe's Oratory, and also in St. Anne de Beaupré. Then the two questions I have are one about, I would like to hear where you think blasphemy or the comments about blasphemy go in your argument, because you kind of dropped that in and left it, and I'm really interested. You said I acknowledge, but I'm not with, it sounded like. So I'd like to hear where the notion of blasphemy goes. And then the second thing I'm thinking about is, I understand your argument, but I'm just wondering whether the notion of automaton is just another, forgive the pun, but mechanism for talking about the inspiriting of, through the mosque or whatever it is that I know very well from West Africa. So that I completely agree with or understand your argument. I'm just wondering whether automaton brings a sense of perhaps Finder say modernity to it, but I mean it was always the case that in Europe the mosque kind of played a role in hiding, at least in the later periods we're talking about, the identity of most Europeans, whereas the mosque turns you into the god, right, in places like in Yoruba cosmology or theology. So I'm wondering about symmetry versus asymmetry once it's applied to what you are calling the automaton. So it's a question about blasphemy and the automaton. Is that clear?
Yes, but I'm really interested in the first comment too. So just for clarity.
I can talk to you about that afterwards.
Yeah, okay. But so the crutches left behind are automata, you're saying?
I'm saying they're part of a notion of automaton that needs to be, that the body is an automaton, and that it has an addendum or it requires an automaton that is not, because the body is not in some way perfect, and then you pray, right? And then there are various forms of old walking devices that are left behind because you got up and you walked out of the oratory. And they're all over. There are more of them than there are the Catholic cardinal hats and everything, disintegrating in Anglican churches all over the place. So I think we need to think about, they are a kind of automaton, they're prayed, left behind, but they could need to be resumed at this point.
Right. So as to the last question, I think thinking through the figure of the automaton gets me somewhere not unlike thinking about a master. That is, I'm not particularly invested in saying the automaton is bringing this whole new perspective to light. I think that it's a vehicle. I'm interested in thinking about religion, the problem of agency, and automata become an interesting way for me to get to what I think are qualities about religion more broadly. That said, in the period that I'm interested in here, the word automaton has this enormous discursive spread and range. And so I actually did not, I backed into this interest in the automaton because I kept finding it in things I was interested in. So for example, possessed Afro-psychiatrists in Brazil studying Afro-Brazilian religions, like Raimundo Lima Rodrigues, in the 1890s, called them, possessed people, automatons and automatism. And the language of automatism comes really out of Charcot and French psychiatry that is lifted wholesale into Brazil. So we get the development of automatism. There's this word cloud, automaton, automatism, automatic, that starts to bind very disparate fields together or link them in strange ways. So psychiatry, criminology, religion, the religion of the other in particular. Then too, Antonio Conselheiro, a dissident religious leader in the 1890s, who is killed by the state, is also called an automaton in Euclides da Cunha's classic Os Sertões. So he is also referred to as a body without will, somebody who is only acting in an automatic fashion. Right, who is possessed. But actually with this word automaton, so I happen to be working a lot on Canudos and trying to interpret it in a new way, which I do in this new book, Ecclesia. So psychiatry, bad religion, it's always bad religion. And the industrial laborer, and this is from Marx, the automaton is, but this expands dramatically. And then you get all these writers like Machado, who has a story much like Hoffman's story of the mechanical love, the man who falls in love with a mechanical being who goes mad. So anyway, it's all over the place. So I came into the word automaton not really interested in it for its own sake, because I kept encountering it as this thing that was imposing itself on areas of my interest in the late 19th century. Blasphemy, I'm not sure what to say. Could
You just dropped it in there and you said he
Did I
was
say the word
considered
blasphemy?
Yes, you said it. Who was the critic?
I think it,
Did you not say the word?
I did not say the word blasphemy.
That's all.
To my knowledge.
I must have misheard it. I thought it was an approach from. Oh, I know, because when you were talking about puppetry, I must have misheard you.
Oh, theology. I
Yeah.
said the word theology, but not blasphemy.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought I heard the word. That's,
Yeah,
that's an odd drop.
Well, that was from Latour, who is saying that these hybrids of person and object, where it becomes unclear who is acting, this actually produces new things. He calls it a theology of creationism.
Oh,
In
okay.
words, so this was
This
the stepping stone I used to talk about the new production that's Ajeeb took part in my agreement.
Thank you so much.
I had a question about, you had mentioned the play RUR and the neologism of robot coming from the word ruba, which means slave or someone who's working under another's orders but without one's own sense of kind of agency or direction. And that notion obviously gets a lot of play in other versions or inheritances of robot automata, like in Asimov's I, Robot, or in Astro Boy in Japan and things like that, where there's all these rules about what robots can and cannot do, and their agency is always overridden by this demand that they not harm humans or that they protect humans. And so there are these interesting kind of questions of agency and enslavement that go on in robot and automata, thinking or whatever. More broadly, it strikes me that might be, or it seems like it might be something that would be interesting in a New World setting such as Brazil, where a lot of the religious applications or uptakes that you're talking about are happening in a West African diaspora of formerly enslaved peoples. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of what you think that language of the automata might be doing in terms of kind of processing or dealing with legacies of enslavement.
Right, that's a great observation. I should have included that in my last response to automaton, because that's the other place the word it's applied in descriptions of slaves, who are also bodies without will. So psychiatry, possession, bad religion, industrial labor, and slavery, which is a version of industrial labor. Absolutely, and I've written at length about links between slavery and the notion of possession, and the play on words between possessors and the possessed, and how it is that that the anthropological comparative figure of spirit possession was so easily moved out of Europe in the early 1600s and to Africa, especially during the acceleration of the slave trade. So that the notion of the irrational body became then more justifiably a target of enslavement. So there's and this appears directly in, say, the writings of Hobbes, as I tried to show. And Kant. So in this whole early formation of Western political philosophy, there's a development of the body as one's own property, but that only a rational being can be a true owner and make contracts, and that Africans are incapable of that, therefore they can't be property. There are more direct references to this. For example, it's a standard interpretation of the Haitian figure of the zombie that this is a historical reference to the body, direct body without will. This is also referenced in rituals in Afro-Brazilian rituals, where, for example, at the end of one's initiation, you are sold at auction. And it's part of the tropes of spirit possession. So slavery is really a part of that. And so I do think that there is a working out of the history of slavery that happens through these mechanisms in a performative way. As to agency being overridden, the demand to not harm humans, well, that's the endless question. Today too, I was thinking of 2001 and how, right, this is the great moment when he turns from the servant to the master. So yeah, I need to think more about that. But that's what happens in RUR. They take over, and it's really a theological story. The play ends, as you probably know better than I do, but it's like the beginning of the world, and there are biblical citations, and it's like a Genesis tale with the robots starting their own world.
I have a very half-formed thought, so it isn't even at the level of a question exactly. But when you were talking about the body within the body, and the question of agency of the body within the body and all of that, is there any connection whatsoever to a gendering of this entire discussion? Because the most common body within the body is the body of the pregnant woman. Okay? And there are also debates through many, many centuries as to at what point the interior body acquires its own spiritual identity. I guess the current aspect of that debate is at what point after conception or whatever is somebody considered a product of that to be a living being or not. And I was listening to your discussion, and while there were occasional images that would suggest a female presence or female considerations, it seemed to me as if much of your discussion was gendered male, both in terms of the automata and their audiences and people playing playing whatever they were playing with them and all of that. So is there a gender component to your thinking about this, and is there any sense in which it connects to everyday reality of the female body, pregnant, whether human or in agricultural societies, of course, the everyday presence of pregnant animals as well?
Yeah, what a great question. Well, I will give an even less formed response. So yes, it is not incidental that the figure of the possessed body is almost always women in practice, actually, and in depictions in Caribbean or Afro-Brazilian traditions. That is the horse of the gods is almost always gendered, is almost always female biologically or gendered, or men identifying as female. So there's this gets to much larger questions, but medical history, of 18th, 19th century always cast the female body as permeable to humors, to emotions, and as incapable, and is therefore viable to automatic action, free of will or deliberation. So I think that's a long-standing trope. It's interesting then that the automaton figures, these maybe one could say that the orientalization is also a feminization, but that they're always male. They're never, and presumably the chess-playing, checker player society of the public sphere is also actually male, because at least in Brazil and presumably elsewhere, women have little part in the public sphere until the 20th century. And if they do, they are fallen women often. So a Brazilian elite household replicates this exterior-interior. Women are in the deep interior of the house. So I think it's a great point. Could become part of the future reworkings of the paper. Oh, thanks.
Any other question?
Forgive me for not knowing more about kind of the rise of carnival in the U.S. context. It seems like there's a duality in that the sort of magic, the autonomous time that can play chess, people who can read the future, playing tic-tac-toe with the chicken, these things that become part of the modern United States of the 19th and 20th century. I don't know how that went in Brazil, but it seems like what can be read as part of religion and spiritism is very much part of a kind of resistance to that, right? That the way that these things become so popular in the United States is in a movement towards technology, right? And in a way, it seems like Finner is his name. It seems like his movement towards technology and recordings and film. It's not P.T. Barnum, but it seems like that is a trajectory which makes sense from the not from the religious side. It was interesting to bring him back to spiritists at the end of his life. So I wonder how these things exist in a Brazilian context outside of the religious context and more in the secular context of using things that would seem supernatural or seem religiously ordained in an increasingly non-religious context.
Right. Yeah. So in the U.S., my colleague Jay Cook has written about Barnum and some of these automaton figures in very much the social history vein that you're describing of transition into massification, the entertainment industry, the game of suspension of disbelief, and the secular public sphere. This is one of the really interesting, and I think you could read Ajeeb that way too, right? I think that I would not want to countervene that argument. I think that's so the very fact that that people are so playful with talking about the soul of the machine, and you could call that a secular mode where it becomes an object of humor. That to me seems straightforward, and that would be the standard line. And I'm trying to point to perhaps some other qualities of the automaton that beyond discourse are actually becoming religiously prolific. The strange thing about the great technological, late 19th century shifts of sound and light and electricity and machines, industrialization, and I think this is why people now work a lot on spiritism, is because so many people are working on science and technology, of course. Right? But that spiritism, which never died out, comes out inspired by the Fox sisters in upstate New York, and then Kardec in France, and then it comes to Brazil by 1860, translations of Kardec, but it never dies out in Brazil. Brazil is the world center of spiritism, and spiritism was cast as not a religion, it's a technology. This is what Kardec said. It's about learning how to use the body as an apparatus, which seemed perfectly plausible in this Figner moment. If you can hear the voice of the dead after they're gone, then perhaps it makes sense that people receive media from the dead around us all the time, and this is merely a new technology that we don't understand yet. And this developed precisely through sound and photography. So there's a huge industry of spirit photography, both in the United States and in France, but in Brazil it becomes even bigger, of people who go to studios to have their picture taken with the spirits of the dead appearing which was not very hard to do once you learned how to do that technique of producing double images. The most famous person in the US is Lincoln's widow, who had multiple photographs of Abe Lincoln after his assassination standing behind her. And so those technologies, instead of debunking religion, actually fomented this whole new religious movement. And I'm arguing something a little bit on those lines, that technologies sometimes debunk one kind of religion, but let loose a different genre. At least that's the angle I'm trying to push.
Okay, thank you so much for all the